Rick Lindroth is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement and Sorensen Professor Emeritus at University of Wisconsin. His research focuses on chemical ecology. Rick, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
So to start, I'd love to just talk about what chemical ecology is and why is it important?
Okay. Maybe let's start by taking a bit of a step back and just saying, what is ecology? A lot of people confuse ecology with environmentalism, and they're not the same. So ecology is a science. It's basically the science of how the world works. But it focuses on organisms and their interaction with their environment. And that environment can be other living things, other organisms, or what we call the abiotic, the non-living environment. So water, light, soil to some extent is non-living and living. So that's the science of ecology, but it really emphasizes interactions between and among organisms. So then what is chemical ecology? Chemical ecology is a subdiscipline of ecology that emphasizes how do chemicals mediate or influence those interactions that are so important for the science of ecology. So most organisms produce some kinds of compounds that affect others. Vertebrates do in terms of, for example, pheromones. We know that flowers do in terms of fragrances. But chemical ecology really emphasizes the compounds that are produced especially by plants, to some extent by fungi, and also to some extent by vertebrates. But I'll focus primarily on plants. That's my area of expertise, and those are the ones that are most well known. So you might ask, what chemicals? Well, I would take another step back or sideways and say that plants have kind of two parallel metabolic systems. They have one whole system like we do to produce what are known as primary metabolites. And those are things like sugars and proteins, fats, lipids, things that are absolutely required for life. And that's why they're called primary compounds, things that all life forms need, they must have. But plants also have secondary metabolic machinery. And we call those secondary metabolites or secondary compounds. And that's a whole raft of additional metabolic processes that produce things like phenolic compounds, including tannins, alkaloids, cyanogenic compounds, terpenoids, literally hundreds of thousands of compounds that plants produce for primarily the purpose of defending themselves from herbivores, but also for other purposes, for example, to attract pollinators. And these compounds are critically important in the ecology of plants. And because plants form the basis of all food webs, they become important for entire ecosystem function. So the importance of these things called secondary compounds or secondary metabolites was first pointed out by Gottfried Frankl in the 1960s, and then it kind of set off this boom of interest in plant chemistry. Really took off in the 1970s, and much of my career was focused on plant chemistry and how it influences things that eat plants, how it influences the things that eat the plants, and then what types of genetic and environmental factors influence levels of these compounds and what compounds are produced. So there you go. These compounds are very important. They're important for humans as well. Caffeine in our coffee, tannins that give the astringency to wine. Something like 75% of human pharmaceuticals are derived from plants. So these things are very, very important, both in the natural world and in, for human civilization.
Yeah. So you mentioned the genetics and also the defense that these compounds kind of provide for plants. What is genetically controlled chemical defense?
So if we were to look at what factors shape the levels of these compounds in plants, three primary factors come to mind: the genetics of the plant, the environment of the plant, and the developmental stage of a plant. So ecologists would refer to plant secondary metabolites as functional traits, and functional traits are traits that organisms have that function in some particular way. So if we were to do a comparison to humans, think about maybe running speed. A person's running speed is a functional trait. It's a combination of their genetic background, their environment, how much training they've been doing, and their age, right? So, and it can be a function of all of those things interacting together. So in a sense, all plant defense chemistry, secondary chemistry, is genetically based because the plants have to have the genetic machinery just to produce them. But some compounds are produced at amounts that are very strongly genetically controlled, and other compounds are more environmentally controlled. Let me give you an example of aspen trees. Aspen trees produce two major sets of compounds that protect them from herbivores and pathogens, and those are salicinoids. They're salicylate-like compounds, very similar to aspirin. In fact, aspirin was derived from the willow family, which is related to aspen. So the salicinoids are strongly genetically controlled. It really doesn't matter what environment you put these plants in, they're going to produce the same amount of, express the same amount of salicinoids as their parents. So from one organism to another, those with different genetic backgrounds will show different levels of these compounds that are being expressed. And it really doesn't matter too much what environment you put them in. However, the other component, the tannins that aspen produce, are highly influenced both by genetics and by the environment. If you grow trees in a low light environment, they have very low levels of tannins. If you put them in a high fertility environment, they'll have lower levels of tannins. And it's strongly controlled by their genes as well. So the genes are very important. They control, they're the basis for production of all these compounds. But for some compounds in some plants, that expression is strongly controlled, like eye color. And for other compounds, it's less strongly expressed, something like, arm strength, which is strongly environmentally influenced as well. So it's a combination of those.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned the kind of the things that they're defending from are herbivores and pathogens. How do you think about the insect-plant interactions and how these interactions change ecosystems?
Oh, that's a very good question, a big one. We could talk for hours on that. But just briefly, as I mentioned, plants are the foundation for nearly all food webs. And they capture energy, radiant energy from the sun. They convert it into high energy molecules, sugars, and then other compounds, which then are used by herbivores to grow and reproduce. And then the herbivores are eaten by predators. And so what plants are able to capture and store in terms of their tissues forms the basis of virtually all life on Earth. So insects are the next step up in most food chains. So insects also are the basis of the food chain for many, many species. Think about the variety, number, biodiversity of birds that require insects for food, or of amphibians, or reptiles, or even mammals, right? So insects are very important for provisioning food to other organisms as well. So plants and insects are very important in terms of basically setting how much energy flows up into an ecosystem. Now, insects, they can have positive or negative effects on ecosystems from a human perspective. And it might be helpful here to think in terms of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are those things that nature provides to humans for free. Things such as pollination, or the production of food or fiber in terms of wood, or fuel, nutrient cycling, water purification, climate regulation, recreational opportunities. Those are all ecosystem services valued at $125 trillion a year that nature provides for free. Now, insects will influence most of those ecosystem services for good or for bad. Let's take some good ones. Pollination. Insects pollinate about roughly 90% of flowering plants. I mean, we would be doomed if we didn't have insect pollinators to pollinate our food. 87 different major food crops are pollinated by insects. In terms of nutrient cycling, insects are important in the breakdown and distribution of organic matter and the formation of soil, which is essential for plant life. Carbon sequestration. Insects can influence carbon sequestration, and either for good or for ill. We might come around to this later, but forests, for example, and soils, prairie soils, are vast stores of carbon, which, and as you know, carbon, when released as CO2, influences climate. So the sustainability of our forest ecosystems, our grasslands, in terms of resistance to pest attack, can strongly influence the Earth's ability to sequester carbon, to keep it out of the air and to reduce climate change. Plant chemistry influences resistance to pest outbreaks. I was just talking about climate change. An interesting case here is the mountain pine beetle in the western United States, which is experiencing massive eruptions and explosions. Many tens, hundreds, even thousands of square miles of damage in some of these areas historically. And that's all tightly controlled by the plant's defense system. And when those trees get stressed, the insects can break through the plant defense system and experience these major eruptive outbreaks. And then one other thing I'll mention in terms of ecosystems is that invasive species are another area of concern for ecosystem function. Think about invasive plants or invasive insects. So with respect to invasive plants, insects can be very helpful as biocontrol agents. So for plant species such as purple loosestrife here in the upper Midwest, or leafy spurge in the West, or prickly pear cactus in the South, or especially in Australia, all of those have been subject to biocontrol by imported targeted insect herbivores that help control those and help reduce the damage of the invasives. But insects themselves can also be invasives and cause tremendous harm. Local example here throughout the Midwest and the East, probably even where you are, is emerald ash borer. Is that a problem in the East?
Yeah.
They're devastating the forests throughout the upper Midwest. There is not an ash tree left in most of the natural forests around me because our trees show no resistance to emerald ash borer. However, interestingly, the ash borer came from China, and Chinese ash trees are resistant, probably chemically based, but we don't really know for sure. So those are some examples of how insects and plants influence ecosystem function and the value of those functions and processes for humans.
Yeah. I want to talk for a little bit about the research and kind of how you do it. Can you talk about what is imaging spectroscopy and how it's used in research?
Sure, yeah. So imaging spectroscopy is more recently been added to the toolbox of chemical ecologists. I've not used it a lot. I work with people who do. But imaging spectroscopy is sometimes known as hyperspectral imaging or remote sensing. It's really an exciting new development in plant ecology and chemical ecology. Think of a camera. It's a technology where each imaging pixel, so a digital camera, captures just a combination of red, green, and blue. So every little pixel is red, green, and blue bands. But instead, imagine a technology that doesn't just capture those three bands, but captures an entire spectrum from infrared all the way through all the visible light waves and into the ultraviolet at each pixel. So it's really amazing technology. So you get whole spectra at each pixel. And then if you fly these cameras over, for example, a forest canopy, The other added benefit is can have three-dimensional scanning. So they can scan and take essentially they're like photographs from the top of a forest canopy all the way down to the forest floor. So they capture pixels in three-dimensional arrays, and each pixel presents a spectrum. Well, what does that spectrum tell us? Well, when we look at a leaf, it looks green because all of the colors are absorbed by the leaf except the green, which is reflected back, and then our eye perceives that as green color. So every plant tissue absorbs some radiation and reflects back others. Some of it we don't see because it's in the IR or the ultraviolet. So that's a spectral signature that is closely associated with the chemical composition of the plant. So now imagine you can fly over a forest, and on the basis of these vast amounts of data, but which can be computer analyzed, right, megadata, we can now get a picture of the chemistry of an entire forest canopy. And that's really advantageous because you can now do work at much larger scales than historically has been done.
So just thinking about this technology and maybe other technologies, what do you see as the future of chemical ecology research?
Yeah, I see chemical ecology research going in several directions. It already is. Let's take the suborganismal first, the molecular level. There's a lot of work being done now to elucidate, to identify the signal transduction processes that allow a plant to sense that it's being eaten, to mount defenses, and then to create the compounds and move them around the plant to improve its defense against that attacking insect or pathogen. So those are called signal transduction pathways, how the plant senses and then mounts a defense to those. A lot of work being done on those. A lot of work being done on the basic genetics and genomics of the production of secondary compounds. What are the biochemical pathways? We still don't know that for many of these compounds. We're trying to understand those. So there's a lot being done at the molecular level. At the other extreme, I just talked about the hyperspectral work and other work at the ecosystem or larger level. So then now we're talking about eco-informatics, vast amounts of data that are coming in and being analyzed by large supercomputing facilities. And then in the middle, between those very small and the very large, is kind of the classical organismal interactions. But here now that's growing in terms of we're not focused only on the plant and the insect, but the plant and the insect and its natural enemies, which is influenced by the plant's defense, or the natural enemy of the natural enemy. And so we're adding on layers and layers of trophic feeding connections and understanding how many of them are influenced by the plant. So now we understand, for example, that plants not only produce compounds to defend them against herbivores, but they produce compounds that attract the enemies of their enemy. So as you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So they lure in parasitoids and predators of the insects that are attacking them. So those are some areas, and probably another one I'll just mention is we know the Earth is changing for a lot of reasons. We've got climate change. We've got disruption caused by land use. All of these things. One new area, one growing area of interest is how does climate change in the broadest sense influence the capacity of plants to produce defense compounds? It can hinder it or it could help it. How does the vast nitrification of the earth that we're doing by pumping nitrates into the air and fertilizing our ecosystems, how is that affecting plants' capacity to defend themselves from insects? So the whole kind of global change aspect is also important.
Yeah, just point on that thread a little bit more. I wonder if I'm curious what you think the next 3 years, the next 10 years, maybe even further out looks like, given these multiple environmental crises that we're facing all at the same time, and what we can do as individuals and organizations.
Yeah, very good question and one that's timely. And I, I don't want to be partisan in my comments here, but I cannot help to be political because we live in a political world. And there's a lot of damage being done right now to science across the board and particular areas of science. Climate change has been one to be, flagged for defunding. I had, as I mentioned to you a while ago, I had a Fulbright Fellowship that had been awarded, gone through the entire process. Everything was lined up, and 4 days before I was to leave to go to Argentina this spring, was defunded because the State Department determined that climate change was no longer a national priority. So, climate change is real. It's human caused, it's real, it's very serious, and it's going to get worse. And we're turning a blind eye to it. And that's going to have serious repercussions for all humans. But and I'm talking about the near future, the next 3 to 4 years. So there's the science that's not being done. There is a pall that has fallen over academic science and probably all science within the US because people are unsure of their futures, they're unsure of their jobs. Scientists are leaving, they're being lured to other countries. This is going to put a significant dent in the capacity of the United States to do science. That will have echoes for decades. This is the long term. You can't just start and stop science like you can start and stop an assembly line. It takes years of training and the acquisition of equipment and setting up of labs. You can't just start and stop on a dime. And then, there's the international reputation of the United States. My colleagues in Argentina were none too happy that the government pulled my funding. And we need to think that science is not, there's some elements of science, especially involved in national security, they're secretive. But 95% of science is not that. It's an international commodity. What I do benefits scientists in Germany and China and in Argentina. What they do benefits me. So it's an international community, and by withdrawing funding and scientists from one of the key players in that international arena is going to have very serious consequences, both in the near term and in the long term. And I'm very concerned about that. Long term, next 10 years, who knows? It depends on not so much whether the government recognizes, because it all depends on who's in power. It depends on whether the public outcry for solid, good, societal benefiting science is sufficiently loud that the politicians will pay attention. So there you go. There's my take on it.
Yeah. Well, Rick, thank you so much for taking the time and for sharing insights and wisdom. And I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Well, thanks for all of your work. I appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to talk today.